government is then the one representing the state in international affairs, and it has legal consequences because that government will sign treaties on behalf of that state, which bind the treaties in international relations. You know, in other words, they can incur binding obligations and rights for the states vis-a-vis other states. Also, the heads of state is immune. The foreign minister is immune from prosecution in other countries. So you can sense it has. It's quite important, and this is a relevant topic at the moment because we know that in Afghanistan there was political turmoil and the Taliban is back in power, and the previous government, the Afghan national government, entirely collapsed and acknowledged that the Taliban has taken over. But governments, other states are now a bit reluctant to recognize the Taliban, if I can put it mildly, because of its terrible human rights record. So once again, no government is obliged to acknowledge this new government, but they can, and it has legal consequences. And in practice, usually governments, since the 1980s, the practice of officially and formally making a declaration, we acknowledge the new government which is coming to being after the elections, wherever, or, you know, whatever. Governments don't often act in that way anymore. They recognize implicitly by allowing the new government to send an ambassador, you know, to the country, allowing the new government to sign new treaties and so forth. It's you by taking up diplomatic relations on the international level, you, by your conduct, give an indication that you acknowledge this new government as the representative of the state on the international level. And they are okay. So now I said that there's no obligation to recognize a new government. But there is also the different question, is there conduct in international law that prohibits the recognition of a government? For example, and this is a big debate, if a government comes into being through a military coup, like we had in Myanmar a couple of months ago, does that mean that other states are not allowed, that international law forbids the recognition of that government? So it's not merely, there's on the one hand, there's no obligation to recognize, but can there be, this from the other perspective, be a prohibition to recognize? Are there certain things that prohibits the recognition of a government? Now, once again, we're not talking about the recognition of states, we're talking about the recognition of a government. And with the recognition of states, there's one very hard rule, and that is that if a state comes into being by the use of force, for example, when Turkey occupied northern Cyprus and actually created a puppet state through the use of force in the 1970s, the international community did not recognize that state, and by extension, of course, then also not the government of that state, because that goes against one of the very, very fundamental principles of international law since 1945, that you cannot annex or you know, create another state through force, and by extension, also they're not, if that state is not recognized, you will not recognize any puppet government that then comes into being. Okay, so that's the one. But actually, traditionally, if we now talk about military force, not where one state, you know, occupies another state. If we now talk about, we have within a country like Afghanistan, there was a civil war, and then the one government, the Afghan national government, which was elected, although, you know, the elections were also rather fragile, and not everyone participated. The participation rate was low, but it was a recognized government, and there were elections, and then they were overthrown by force by the Taliban. Now, for many, many years, according to the classic doctrine of effective control, it doesn't really matter what happens inside a country, whether the government came into control through force or through elections. The classic doctrine is that's not the concern of the outside world. What is important is that government, which calls itself the government, is actually in control of most of the territory, and usually also the concrete sign is control over the capital, because that means control over the ministries, control over the military, the central bank, all these important state organs. So it doesn't matter if it's an undemocratic state. It doesn't matter whether there was a military coup. There needs to be stability. There needs to be a government which is in control, and it has to have established itself. It has to be likely that it's going to continue to remain in power. So that was the classic doctrine. But already in around 1920, there was the Tobar doctrine in Latin America that tried to challenge this. Certain Latin American countries opposed the notion of unconstitutional change of government. They argued that once that a government that does not stick to where a government is where there's a change of government that is not done in accordance with the constitution, and that usually means without free and fair elections, then that government should not be recognized. Because in Latin America, there were a lot of problems, and until actually the 1980s with coup governments. So already by the 1920s, there was an attempt within Latin America to curb unconstitutional change of government, where there's a kind of a revolution and the democratically elected government is then overthrown. However, at that point in time, and that was 100 years ago, this attempt to outlaw unconstitutional change of governments that did not change in line with the procedures foreseen by law and by the constitution, and that is usually free and fair elections, should not be recognized. But that attempt to elevate this doctrine to a legal principle failed at the time. And there was a famous arbitration case at the time, the Tinoco arbitration, which underscored no, effective control is still the point of departure. Okay, so then there was the Cold War, and by the end of the Cold War, there was this upsurge, there was this very ideal, you're probably all too young to remember that, but in the 1990s, when I was in my early and mid-20s, there was this hope that now democracy will take hold in Central and Eastern Europe and the rest of the world, and in Africa, because now the Soviet Union collapsed and so on. And there were a few situations, and first of all sorts of regional organizations and international organizations committed themselves to democracy. They paid lip service to democracy in all sorts of declarations, but they didn't really define what they meant. And those of you who study political science and politics and democratic theory will know that it's an incredibly difficult concept to define and to pin down. But it seemed that the smallest common denominator was like free and fair elections. So there was this idea that only governments, at least governments that came about by free and fair elections, had to be recognized as the government, and where a free and a fair election, a government which was freely and fairly elected, was overthrown by a coup government, by the military, for example, that could not be recognized. So there was There was an attempt amongst human rights lawyers and also in literature to really push for elevating free and fair elections to a requirement for recognition of a government in international law. And there were early examples. If you remember 1991 in Haiti, there was a military coup and President Aristide, the first time he was booted out of power, the international community and the Organization of American States and the UN and so on did not recognize the new coup government. They insisted that Aristide be reestablished. Also, there was in 1997 in Sierra Leone in Africa, there was a similar situation, and the government that was booted out, the democratically elected government that was then booted out, was still recognized. But then there's a lot of literature and a lot of debate about now democratic legitimacy is a requirement. I mean, these were only two examples. We are talking here of 194 states. So there was way too early optimism in my mind about, yes, we saw true democracy rose in importance, undoubtedly, and it could be a factor that waters down or dilutes the notion of effective control. So, you can say, okay, not in all, there can be circumstances where effective control can be replaced by democratic legitimacy. But it doesn't mean it has to be. And like I said, organizations were committing themselves formally to the notion of democratic governments as the preferred form of governance, and two regional organizations that did so, they actually amended their constitutional framework, was the Organization of American States and the African Union. And through, this is just as background information, the Organization of American States also by 2001 had adopted the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And they were very much, it's also a region that is very troubled by military coups. And so since 1991, they adopted instruments on the regional level aimed at curbing military coups. And they also, in the Inter-American Democratic Charter, introduced this notion of a unconstitutional interruption or alteration of the democratic order, which is a broader concept. And it's still very much debated, what does that mean? Does it mean election tampering? And what in Latin America is a big problem is what they call self-coups, where the executive gobbles up the parliament and sometimes the judiciary. So the executive, the government, grabs the power away from the parliament and sometimes with the help of the courts. And we saw similar problems. We're having similar problems in some of our Eastern European neighboring countries, where the executive expands its own power at the expense of the parliament and the courts. And so you don't have a real proper separation of powers, trias politica, anymore. And so this notion of unconstitutional interruption or alteration of the democratic order should be interpreted in the light of these self-coups that was a big problem and still is in Latin America. And according to the Inter-American Democratic Charter, if this happens, if there is like a military coup or more than that, not just a coup, but also these other forms of alterations of the democratic order, the Organization of American States can impose sanctions on that country, suspend it from participation in the meetings. And the question is whether it can also de-recognize the government, say, we do not recognize you anymore as the government, because just kicking out a government from an organization is not the same as or suspending an organization, the membership of a government in an organization is not the same as saying we're not recognizing you. Those are two different things. Now, before the Inter-American Democratic Charter was adopted, there was, like I said, the Resolution 1080 of 1991 and the Protocol of Washington, which was not entirely as strongly worded as the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And in that era, the Organization of American States, well, like I said, they adopted these instruments, but they didn't really apply them very consistently. There were all sorts of problems with coups and self-coups in Latin America, and the only time that the Organization of American States actually acted with sanctions, suspension, and so on was in Haiti in 1991 with the first coup. And when there was a second coup in 1994 against the same guy, Aristide, they didn't act. And in Guatemala, there was a self-coup in 1993 when they acted. But in other situations, you know, they were reluctant to act. And in the post-charter area, there was the Inter-American, there was the coup in Honduras in 2009. There, the OAS actually acted and suspended Honduras until the situation was resolved. And you may have followed the Venezuelan situation, which was very interesting. There was already in 2002 an imploded coup, collapsing coup against Chavez, and there the OAS did nothing. And since 2017, there's an ongoing, well, what is it now, almost 5 years, problem 17, 18, 19, 20, 1, 2, yes, with Maduro, which engaged in a self-coup. And with the help of the Supreme Court, where he had his allies, he basically he very much weakened the parliament, the national parliament. Because what happened was parliament, there was a national assembly, had an election, and his party then lost the majority. So the opposition had the majority in the parliament, and he's a president with, but he had the parliament against him. So he tried to weaken their powers. And this actually by 2019. Oh, and thereafter there was an election which was fraudulent and, you know, racked with all sorts of problems and election tampering and intimidation and so on. And then in 2019, the Organization of American States determined that this was an alteration of the constitutional order. So there was this was like and it's interesting, there were many other instances in Latin America where there are also problems with election tampering and all sorts of problems, but only in this particular instance, they actually take this decision. However, the organization was very divided. And as we know, Maduro, you know, he has powerful enemies in the United States and Canada and the UK in the West. The EU is more ambivalent, but he has also prominent allies like the Russians and the Chinese behind him. And he has some allies also in the OAS. So the OAS itself was also very divided. So what this meant is that although this alteration of the constitutional order was determined, he was not, the OAS did not suspend Venezuela. They didn't have enough votes to suspend him. So nonetheless, 16 of the OAS members claimed that they did not recognize him, or what they said was that they recognized the president of the parliament, Guaido, Mr. Guaido, as the interim president of Venezuela until elections could be held. The problem only was those elections were not going to happen. I mean, Maduro still has, it's not that he has no support in Venezuela. There are still parts of the society that actually support him. So, and Guaido, everybody had, or the Western countries had hoped that the Maduro government would collapse, that the military would no longer support him, but that actually didn't happen. So, the United States, Canada, and the UK explicitly recognized the Guaido government. With the Latin American countries, there was this lip service to recognizing Guaido, but it's not clear whether that was just like some vague sort of political support or whether it was really de-recognition. You know, it seemed to be somehow saying it's not really clear. It was they were very ambivalent. The same with the European Union. They kind of gave and the European Union states, they gave some political support to Guaido, tried to support him in dialogue, engage in conversation, and so on. But there was no de-recognition of Maduro in the sense that they stopped doing business with him. This was different in the UK and Canada and the United States. And they actually, for example, do not allow the Maduro government anymore to have access to assets, to the millions of pounds or dollars that the Maduro government has in banks in those countries. He's not allowed to access it. So that's like also a way of exerting political pressure on him. But he still is recognized at the UN level. He still sends his representatives to the UN. And so you see, there's a very confusing situation with about 50 states in total that claim they recognize Guaido. But first of all, 50 states, there are 194 states out there. 50 is just like a quarter. It's also not clear what all of those states really meant with recognition. Did they really mean de-recognition of the other guy? It's very vague. And in such a situation where there is so much confusion, it's very difficult also for other states to know who should you be dealing business with. And ultimately, to de-recognize, and we'll see that when we now get to the African Union, if you de-recognize a government, that only really works if all the big actors agree. You have to have agreement between all the major powers, the Western powers, Russia, the Chinese, everybody kind of have to agree in some way or another. Look, this government is just terrible. We can't deal with it anymore. It is of no use to us. It has to go. And it has happened a few times in Africa in particular. But if you don't have that consensus, then you get this kind of very problematic situation, which is greatly confusing with Venezuela. Okay, so just to say, and I'm now getting back to Africa, but so these are the two regions, the organizations of Africa. So to conclude on Latin America, they have this commitment there to democracy and to count formally in the OAS chart on several legal documents, but they haven't really managed to abolish unconstitutional change of government within that region, especially this kind of alteration of the constitutional order where we think of election tampering and abolishing the separation of powers and that kind of thing, self-coups. It's still endemic. So we cannot really say that that region has succeeded in implementing this commitment to democratic governance, which they have on the continent in these legal instruments. And we can, and also democratic governance has not replaced effective control as the starting point for whom should we actually recognize as the government. It can be relevant, but most of the time, effective control is still, very, very important for deciding who has to be recognized as a government. And of course, in Europe, just before I get to Africa, in most European countries and Western states, you have democratic governance and effective control combined in one government. The Austrian government is in effective control of the state apparatus, and it's also elected by the people. The same with most European countries. So it doesn't have to be either the one or the other. I just wanted to make clear that very, very often in functioning countries, you have both. But that is Europe and the Western world. Outside of the Western world, there's much less democracy. And then, of course, this question arises of how can we demand democratic governance of those regimes under international law? And I don't think that there is such a legal obligation, because as we see, even regions like the OAS and the African Union, as we will see now, regions that have actually formally embraced these notions of democratic governance and rejects unconstitutional change of government in their constitutive documents in their regional treaties, they have difficulty in applying these concepts. So I don't regard them as really hard legal obligations. Now, in Africa, of course, the problems with coups and violence was so much more worse than even than also in Latin America. And by the turn of the century, the African Union was founded. The previous organization was the OAS, the Organization of African States. And the AU also responded to its own history of violence and military coups and the genocide in Rwanda and the constant overthrow of governments by rebel groups and sometimes mercenaries, and also governments clinging to power. Chapi being voted out of power, and he just doesn't want to go. So the Article 4P of the Constitutive Act of the AU rejects unconstitutional change of government. And to define that, you have to read the Constitutive Act together with the Lomé Declaration, and then there's the African Charter of Democracy. And they were like 5 important things. What is an unconstitutional change of government? Where a democratically elected government is overthrown by a military coup, mercenaries, armed groups, or where the incumbent president refuses to concede his electoral loss. And then there's also this broader vague principle, or where there's an infringement of the principles of democratic change of government. This is rather, no, it's also vague, not clear what it means. But if you go back to the history of this principle, which is supported in the African Democracy Charter, you will see there's a big problem in Africa also with presidents extending their own term limits. They will change the constitution, to give them another term limit. Putin has done the same recently in Russia, but it's a very big problem in Africa and also in Latin America. But the wording remained vague because not all African countries want this to be prohibited. There are many African presidents that actually like to extend their term limits. So the best that at the time that this was adopted in 2007 was this rather vague wording, but it was adopted against this background of the manipulation of presidential term limits. Now, if we look at what has been happening on the African continent over the last 20 years or so, how did the African Union actually respond? What did it do with these principles? Now, it has to be said in all fairness that there were several coups. I'm not going to list them. They're in the article. You can read up on them. They actually suspended these several countries that engaged in military coups until the situation, the other government came. What usually happens, then there will be some sort of transitional government, and that is negotiated amongst the parties, and then there's an election, okay, and then the suspension is lifted. But what you also see is that these they will suspend them and there will be sanctions. But it's almost always small, weak countries which are not of great geopolitical relevance. It's very different where these countries are of geopolitical relevance. Mali, Egypt, Sudan. Now, in Mali, there was a coup in 2012, and the African Union did suspend the government, but ECOWAS, which is a regional organization in the west of Africa, was not happy about that because of the dynamics within the region. So what then happened was that the junta government was allowed to participate in the transitional government that then was negotiated and in place for some time before there were elections. And in Egypt in 2013, when Morsi, who was democratically elected, booted out by Sisi, the African Union actually, to their credit, suspended Egypt promptly. But the West and Europe and the United States did not even mention a coup. Nada, nothing. Because they were actually happy that Sisi was there. He was regarded as a bigger ally than Morsi, who was very deeply involved with the Muslim Brotherhood and who was regarded as a radical. So, they were quite happy, actually, that Sisi was in place. And then in the case of Sudan, when there was the coup in 2019, it took the African Union 2 months to suspend Sudan because the Chinese were in the background, and Sudan is of great regional importance, and there's oil and all sorts of stuff. And so there was they just tried first to, negotiate some solution, but when that didn't happen and Sudan cracked down, also the coup government was very, very harsh on civilians, then there was a suspension. So there you can see that if it's a strong country with a strong military and which has resources such as oil and which has very strong allies like the Chinese, or in the case of Egypt, the United States, the consistency in applying these principles collapses. And then there's also another real problem. Coups. Is there a difference between a good coup and a bad coup? And some would say, and this is a big debate, that the Egyptian coup, one shouldn't forget there were millions of people on the streets protesting against Morsi. There were all sorts of problems. He was very radical. So some would make the argument that was a good coup. In Zimbabwe, when Robert Mugabe was finally booted out of office swiftly, without one shot being fired, thank goodness, by the military, in 2017, after having been in power for something like 40 years, well, it came into power, when was that, 1980, 90, 2000, 10 years, almost 40 years. No one in Africa or outside of Africa even thought about suggesting that this was a coup. It was a coup, okay? But nobody used the word. It was just like he was everybody hoped there would be a new dawn, a new beginning, which then, of course, there wasn't, because the coup governments are rarely better than their predecessors, and the chap who's in charge now there is quite problematic as well. But just to say that now you think the notion of a military coup is quite clear. You have an elected government, here comes the military junta, and zack, they throw the guy out. It's wrong, it's unconstitutional, should be forbidden, full stop. But even with coups, it's not agreed amongst African countries. Apparently, what we see from the Zimbabwean situation, that all coups are bad coups. And in Thailand, just to place this in a global context, Zimbabwe wasn't suspended from anything in 2017. They're still around with everything. And in Thailand in 2014, there was a coup. And nobody seemed to notice, and the government was recognized, and the UN and everybody just kind of acquiesced and accepted that. Different the situation in Myanmar, but, there's a qualitative difference there as well. Now, there was a coup, and, there's a very brutal human rights situation with the Rohingya, that minority, being very much persecuted by the Myanmar government. There are actually allegations and charges of genocide against Myanmar for what they're doing to that Muslim minority. So there is also the question. So I think the extreme human rights, the character of the human rights violations in Myanmar has resulted in the rest of the world being very ambivalent. They don't openly do business with Myanmar. The UN hasn't openly accepted Myanmar, the new government, to send representatives to the United Nations. The seat remains empty. Myanmar's seat at the UN remains empty. It doesn't seem that there's a complete and entire rejection and like a de-recognition, saying we're not recognizing you. Some here and there a country may have done that, but on the whole, it's also rather ambivalent. And once again, why? They have the Chinese on their side and they have oil. So you see, once again, when there's a geopolitical, there are resources there, all sorts of political, geopolitical, powers protecting them. At the same time, there's immense discomfort with the human rights situation. So there is an ambivalence, and we don't know what's going to happen in terms of recognition. But they also haven't been suspended from the UN or any such an organization. Rather, just the UN has not yet accepted the credentials of they've decided to postpone any decision. That's what usually when countries are so divided. And this new junta government wants to send its representatives to an international organization. The organization usually, then they have to say, okay, we accept your credentials as the new representative. And when there is such a sensitive situation, they defer the decision, they delay the decision, so they don't take a decision. And hopefully, there'll be some political compromise along the way. So one often sees that. So that was the coup situation in Africa. And there were lots of them. And like I said, on the whole, the African Union did act, but not always with consistency. Now, with rebel overthrows, there were two interesting incidents in recent times. The Central African Republic, where a rebel group overthrew the government and was suspended until the elections. And then the country was suspended from AU business until elections were held. So there the African Union was quite consistent. In Libya in 2011, it was very, very different. There was also there was civil conflict, and ultimately the Gaddafi government was overthrown by rebels, but they received military assistance, airstrikes by NATO, the US, France, and the United Kingdom, and this was authorized by United Nations Security Council resolution under Chapter 7 of the Charter. Now, as you may remember, it was very, very controversial whether actually these countries, the NATO countries, abused this mandate, that they went further, the regime change that followed. This resolution did authorize force to protect civilians who was under threat from the Gaddafi regime. But whether that really meant regime change in the sense that these countries, these NATO countries, should assist the rebels in overthrowing Gaddafi, that's very contested within and outside Africa. That being said, if one assumes, just for the sake of argument, that the resolution did allow for such an overthrow, then this type of overthrow is different because you have to, legally it has a different quality because of this United Nations Security Council resolution. At the time that the African Union was created and the drafters included this idea that a democratic government cannot be overthrown by rebel groups, they were thinking of the Central African scenario, the classic scenario where a group within the country overthrows their democratically elected government. They did not contemplate a situation where the United Nations Security Council actually, under Chapter 7 of the Charter, authorized such an overthrow. Okay, so this is a kind of situation that wasn't foreseen at the time that the Constitutive Act was drafted. Once again, you see the complexities, that it's not always clear, what do we mean by a rebel overthrow? Do we mean all rebel overthrows? Or does it not include these overthrows where, for example, the Security Council was involved? Now, if we look at Afghanistan very recently, there we had an overthrow by the Afghan government, weak, very, very, very weak government, to some extent democratically elected. But, as you know, they just rolled over. You remember, then they just gave over in August. And they said, no, it's done. The Taliban is back and they have conquered. It's not like you have competing governments, like they're still hanging in there and saying, we were democratically elected, you should still recognize us. And the Taliban say, no, we're in control. I mean, the former government is out. They're gone. They left the weapons. They're out of there. there's no dispute about the fact that the Taliban is in effective control. However, once again, like in Burma, and even worse probably than in Burma, the human rights abuses by the Taliban is so extreme that Western governments and other governments are not keen to recognize this government. And the UN, they also are not yet. It's the same thing. Their credentials have not been accepted. The credentials, the United Nations has delayed decisions on deciding on this. It's not clear what is going to happen, because on the one hand, you don't want to recognize a government like this. On the other hand, you have to do business with somebody. And if you want to influence this government, and if you wanted to, to convince it to change its ways, it will have to, I don't want to use the reward it, but you'll have to take it seriously in some way and acknowledge it in some way. So that's also a situation in motion, and the Russians and the Chinese, also Afghanistan, its regional location is quite important, and it's close. There are all sorts of security issues, global security issues at stake, with Iran being close by, the Russians, the Chinese. So if Afghanistan once again becomes an area where all terrorists can just, like Al-Qaeda did in the 1990s, do as they please and operate without control, that's also not something that any country or Western countries also have any interest in. So if you want to prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a complete haven for terrorists, you will have to figure out something with this appalling Taliban government, and also somehow have discussions and collaborations with other countries in the region, including the Russians and including the Chinese. There's just no way beyond that. But you don't want to be seen as embracing this Afghan government. So that's also why the countries are at the moment very ambivalent. Okay, if we now come back to Africa, I'm almost done. There have actually been interesting cases. Now, remember, I said there are these situations: military coups, overthrows by mercenaries, overthrows by armed groups, refusal to concede electoral loss. That's where I am now. And then the infringement of the principles of the democratic changes of government. Now, the refusal to concede electoral loss, here the African Union actually on 3 occasions has been acting very consistently. In 2013, 10 and 17, where the chappie who was voted out of office just refused to go. And then he was de-recognized, and the other chappie won clearly. So then he was de-recognized by everybody. But why? These are examples of small, weak countries. Everybody was fed up with them. They had no friends left at all anymore in the region. Bad behavior had made everybody sick and tired of them, and they were very, they were weak and of no major strategic importance. So ECOWAS, the regional organizations, the sub-regional organizations, the African Union, the United Nations, all the major powers were in agreement. Yes, de-recognize the old guy, recognize the new one. So there was consensus, and but it's very unlikely that if in Egypt or, one of these major players on the African continent, something similar happened, that you will have a similar reaction. But this, where there's election tampering, where a chappie stays in power because he made free and fair elections impossible, voter rigging, that is not yet, that's a rampant problem in Africa. It's a rampant problem in Latin America. And that is not yet, there's no reaction yet by the African Union, no sanctioning or other punishment of governments who remain in power through election tampering, which is probably because it's also difficult to measure, if the guy has tampered, but you don't really know, would he have actually lost if he hadn't tampered? That's also, it's very difficult to tell. And then this whole issue of manipulation of presidential term limits. And just in Venezuela, it seems that in the case of Maduro in 2019, there, if we just compare, like I said, there was this, the OAS did determine that this was a alteration of the constitutional order. But in the African context, the African Union was not yet willing to go that far. And it has also not yet invoked this one. Infringement of principles of democratic change of government. Like I said, it was intended to address the issue of the manipulation of presidential term limits. Good luck. It's not going to happen. In Latin America, there was this attempt to address it, but the outcome is uncertain. As you know, we have comparable challenges in Central and Eastern Europe. I don't see even the EU taking any serious action. Maybe you have other ideas on that, and definitely not their recognition. So, where does this lead us to? Now, I spoke about the African Union, but I also try to place it in a bit of a broader context more generally. We're dealing with indeterminate concepts. The first thing, if we say, is the democracy a requirement for recognizing a government, what do we mean? Even if we only talk about free and fair elections, it's not really clear how we measure that. We saw it with coups. We're not entirely sure whether there's such a thing as a good or a bad coup. We saw it with overthrows by rebel groups. In the case of Libya, is that the kind of overthrow that the African Union had in mind, where you also had a Security Council resolution? The case of Afghanistan, okay, there was an overthrow, and it's a terrible government which is in place, but that's what you have to deal with. The previously democratically elected one just ran away. So what are you now going to do? If you're going to de-recognize this lot, then what? Who are you going to deal with? So these concepts are not very clear in themselves. And then also these things like alteration of the constitutional order, infringement of the democratic governance. It's not really clear, what do we mean with that? And that makes it very difficult to say, yes, democratic legitimacy is a must, because we don't even know exactly what we're talking about. Geopolitical security concerns is a really interesting and important factor. And, if you look at Libya, and I grew up in South Africa, and I lived there again for 10 years until 2019. And I was on the continent when the whole Libya drama unfolded. And that was also for me a learning experience, because it really showed me how terrible it is if you do not take effective control seriously. Gaddafi was a terrible leader. But the way that he was overthrown and the chaos and the destruction that has since resulted, which didn't only destroy Libya, but completely destabilized the region, immensely contributed to the refugee flow, which we are dealing with in Europe, that whole region is much worse off. So that tells us that effective control is incredibly important, even if it's an unpleasant government. You need efficiency and control as a stabilizing factor. It's a very old-fashioned way of looking at the world, but just assuming that you can do away with effective control, which Gaddafi had, and think it's all going to be wonderful and we're going to build it didn't work in Libya. Look what Afghanistan looks like now. The destabilizing effect of ignoring effective control can be very, very detrimental geopolitically, also in terms of security concerns. And now the issue I talked about recognition, because of it's also there are legal aspects to it and so on. But remember, even if you recognize a country like Syria, Afghanistan, South Africa during apartheid, you can still punish the country. You can still sanction it. You can still impose economic. South Africa, the apartheid government was never de-recognized. It was the government that negotiated treaties and so on. It was an illegitimate government, a terrible one. But it was acknowledged as representing the country, and it was nonetheless punished. There were very, very heavy sanctions in place. There are sanctions in place against Bashar al-Assad and some of his representatives. We have already UN sanctions in place against many Taliban and Al-Qaeda characters in Afghanistan. So there are ways of, on the one hand, acknowledging a government and still punishing it. And if we ask ourselves, where does this leave us with democracy and its role in international governance? I do think there has been improvement. It's not fair, especially if we look at the African continent and at these extreme situations of military coups. You know, it's not that easy for an African government to get away with that anymore. It has definitely become harder, and probably also in Latin America. But that doesn't mean that democracy is well established in these regions because of these massive problems with other things like election tampering and manipulation of the separation of powers and term limits. Okay,